prevalent among. So diarrheal disease was very prevalent among kids in São Paulo. And during my time there, I fell in love with Brazil, and I said I wanted to go back to Brazil someday to work there for long term. And I had that opportunity when I joined Cornell as a faculty member after I came back from India. Cornell had been working in Brazil for many, many years, long before I even started working there. And so when I joined the faculty, I had an opportunity to start my own projects in Brazil. And I've been working, that was in 1990, and I've been working there ever since. So that's how I ended up. And then the kind of diseases that I was working in Brazil, when I worked on the diarrhea project in São Paulo, we learned very quickly that many of these kids were coming from the local slum communities, so what in Portuguese is called favelas. And then when I joined Cornell to work on other infectious diseases, such as tuberculosis, I also learned that more than 90% of the people who develop TB live in these informal human settlements. And that was done mostly in Salvador, Brazil, in the Northeast. The other, another disease that I wasn't expecting, I didn't know anything about, that I ended up working on, is a disease called leptospirosis, which I'll mention a little bit during the talk. And that disease also turns out to be something that only happens in these favelas. And so, so let me get started. So let me ask you now a question. Where do you think this picture is from? And you can maybe, since they're not that many of you, maybe you can just say, you can just tell me, just unmute yourself and just guess. Any guesses?
Floor is open. I'll guess that this is the U.S. about 50 years ago.
No, if you look closely, I don't know if you can see my arrow here. What is that in the center, right above? Can you see my arrow?
It looks like the White House, kind of. I'm blind though.
I don't know. Brooklyn?
So, you know, this is the Eiffel Tower going up.
Oh, the Eiffel Tower. Wow.
So this is 1872.
Oh.
So this is what Paris looked like back then. Okay, and what about this?
Japan.
Yeah, this is Tokyo in 1940, right after World War II. And this?
Looks like India.
Good. Do you know what part of India? So this is what it looks like in 2010 in Chennai. Yeah, back in 2010, I was actually on sabbatical. So I went to different parts of the world, taking photographs of these types of communities in different parts of the world. And here, what do you think this is? Right in the backyard.
Oakland, okay.
So when you go to Chennai, if you go from the airport to downtown Chennai, there's a neighborhood called Saidapet, and you cross this river on a bridge. And if you cross this bridge at night, this is what you'll see. You see these billboards, you know, depicting the kind of lifestyle that a large proportion of the Indian population lives by. The middle class of India, as many of you know, is larger than the entire population of the United States. So of course they're going to have the kind of lifestyle depicted by these billboards. But if you cross this bridge in the middle of the day, you'll see the other side of India. And you see the stark contrast between the two types of lifestyles. And when you see this contrast, you also see a huge disparity in the type of health problems that these people encounter. And so in Berkeley, you know, Berkeley, the School of Public Health at Berkeley is known for their research on social and environmental determinants of health. And so we know that these determinants of health or disease are associated with these disease outcomes, such as tuberculosis, diarrhea disease, AIDS. But one of the surprising things that I discovered, that many of our MPH students graduate after 2 years without really knowing what causes these diseases, especially like tuberculosis. You know, they know that these, you know, poverty and injustice and social disparity, all these things are associated with these diseases. But if you ask them, okay, what causes tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is the #1 killer of adults due to a single infectious agent. They can't tell you, except my infectious disease MPH, they know. But the other MPHs won't be able to tell you what causes tuberculosis. And how can you graduate with an MPH degree without knowing what causes TB? So this, what causes disease is often left blank, even in the School of Public Health like Berkeley. And so what we teach in our infectious disease programs are the biology of these diseases, what actually causes these diseases. And then we know that these conditions create this vicious cycle. And so, yes, these disease outcomes will in turn affect the social determinants of health and then vice versa. And so this is what, where the vicious cycle gets established. But you need the biology for this vicious cycle to be established. And so if you only study the social determinants of disease and the disease outcomes associated with the social determinants of disease, you're really missing a whole chunk of knowledge. And so we study this part on the right. What are the factors? What are the direct causes of these outcomes? And how do these disease outcomes affect the social and environmental and economic determinants of health?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the places that we do this is in Brazil. So this is a picture that someone else took in a neighborhood in São Paulo, in a neighborhood called Paraisópolis. And then this is the picture that I showed you in Chennai. And when you see the stark contrast, you see on the left side, the picture in São Paulo, Brazil, you see this community, this informal human settlements here, in contrast to this these high-rise buildings. And this kind of sort of stark contrast in the living styles led Geeta Verma, a sociologist in India, in her book called Slum in India, to say that the root cause of urban slums is not in urban poverty, but in urban wealth. And that's exactly what's contributing to what we're seeing here in our own backyard. This is Berkeley. There's the extreme wealth that creates these kind of conditions. It's not the poverty. And so, and this is, of course, something that's happening all over the world with the urbanization. And in 2007, for the first time, the people living in urban centers of the world surpassed those people living in rural areas. And in 2013, there was a report that came from UN Habitat that really addressed this issue, the challenge of slums. And even in the this sustainable development goal, that for the first time they used the word slums in one of the goals. And until then, the word slum was totally non-existent. And when I use a slum, it has this kind of a pejorative connotation, but it is an official terminology used by the UN to describe these types of informal human settlements. And so this is the operational definition that the UN uses. So these are human settlements with inadequate access to safe water, inadequate access to sanitation and other infrastructure, poor structural quality of housing, overcrowding, and insecure residential status. So this report from 2003 describes demographic, socioeconomic, legal, and social indicators of 1 billion people who live in slums. So by the definition that I just showed you, about 1 billion people who fit into these communities as described by the definitions. So life expectancy under 5 mortality, access to improved water sources and sanitation, slum upgrading programs, poverty reduction programs. But what's missing from this report is the health burden measures. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult to measure health in these types of communities. You really have to go in there to really assess what's going on. In places like India, even before the pandemic, there are many deaths that went unreported, non-recorded. And even births often don't get reported in many of these communities. If they don't get reported, These people officially don't exist. If they don't exist, they can't go to school, they can't get health insurance, and that really leads to the kind of health disparity that we see. So just again, back to São Paulo, Piraeus. So just hone in on that section of this city, this neighborhood. And you saw this, and if you can see this close up, and if you look at these high rises, you see this this building on the right. You have these little swimming, almost like a small swimming pools in each deck. And even by U.S. standards, this is extreme. I don't know if any of us ever lived in an apartment building with a swimming pool in the deck, but this is a extreme contrast to those people to the kind of neighborhood you see on the left side. And so if you look at the kind of diseases that people living on the right side of this fence here might get, you see, yes, the people, the little kids living on the right side of this fence will develop diarrhea and acute respiratory infection, TB, AIDS, etc., as do people on the left side of the fence. But in addition, people who live on this side develop this disease that I mentioned a few minutes ago, leptospirosis, but they also develop meningitis, all the hepatitis, vaccine preventable diseases. People on the right, if they develop TB, yes, they'll get treated. But if people on the left, if they don't get treated, or if they don't get treated properly, they'll end up developing multi-drug resistant TB. Not just TB, but multi-drug resistant TB. And rheumatic heart disease, this is what I'm going to talk about today. You would never see rheumatic heart disease occurring in people living on the right side. But rheumatic heart disease is one of the most common causes of heart disease in young people who live on this side of the fence. And advanced cervical cancer. Women are more likely to develop advanced cervical cancer on the left side because they don't get screened with Pap smear every year. They're more worried about feeding their kids than getting screened with Pap smear. And then, of course, COVID-19. This is a dramatic impact on health disparity in people who live in these informal settlements. And here's an example of an article that appeared back in early part of the pandemic. Here, a Brazilian woman caught coronavirus on vacation. Her maid is now dead. So this woman, who's from a very wealthy family, went to Italy for a vacation. She came back, and that was the time when Italy was at the epicenter of COVID. And she came back to Brazil. And then her maid got infected, and she's dead. And this is something, and she's one of the first people to die in Brazil from COVID. And this is something that happens all the time. And so these are some of the projects that we're doing in Salvador, Brazil, but in other parts as well. And so I'm only going to talk about maybe leptospirosis quickly, and then rheumatic heart disease. So Salvador is located here in the X. How many of you been to Salvador? I know, I'm sure the gentleman from Recife. Oh, Paulo, you've been to São Paulo. Salvador, right? So Recife, I've been to Recife, just north of Salvador. So Recife is a very nice place as well. So this is what Salvador looks like. So Salvador right now is, I think, the third largest city in Brazil. But there are communities like this all over the city. And this is a community called Pau de Lima, which is actually close to the airport in Salvador. And we have a team that's been working here for many, many years. And you can see it's located in a valley. So during the rainy season, this entire area gets flooded. And leptospirosis is a disease that you get from wading in floodwater that's contaminated with rat urine. And so this is what the organism looks like. It's a type of bacteria. And it can cause hepatitis and kidney disease. So this is a gentleman with a jaundice due to liver disease. And this is someone who's required peritoneal dialysis because his kidneys shut down. And then sometimes it can also cause what's called a hemorrhagic pneumonitis. So you get blood in the lungs. mortality. It's about 15% mortality associated with this disease, no matter what you do for them. And so this is how this community evolved over time. So in the 1950s, this was a kind of an Atlantic rainforest area with no residential units. And then by mid-1970s, you begin to see these formal human settlements outside of this demarcated area. And then in the 80s, you begin to see these informal settlements being built inside this area. And by early 2000, just completely covered with these informal settlements. So this demarcated area is where we've been studying leptospirosis. And so we know that the adult males have the highest rates of infection, even though everybody gets infected, both gender and all age groups do get infected. It's the adult males who have the highest rates of infection. And adult males have 10 times the risk for developing severe leptospirosis and go on to death. And so because the males are the main income earning members of these communities, there's a huge economic impact on these communities. And the risk of mortality goes up with age. So this is a team that's been working here for many, many years. And this gentleman here on the right is Albert Koh, who was my postdoc from the US, who actually spent 15 years there working. He became faculty at Cornell, and then he's now a professor and the chair of the department at one of the departments at the Yale School of Public Health. And so he continues to go back and forth, Yale to Brazil to work on this. And this is his team. And this gentleman in the middle here with the beard and glasses is Mitamaya Galvan Reis, who is the director of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Salvador. And it was him that made it possible for us to work there. And so he has a very strong relationship with this community. And the reason for that is because when he was a medical student, he actually lived in this community. He's from a very poor community in the state of Bahia. And when he was a medical student, he actually had to live here. He became a physician and then became director of this major research institute. And so he facilitated our group to work in this. And one of the things that Albert Koh did was to incorporate many of the residents, these young residents of the community, in the research team. And so in the process, they learned how to do research. In fact, Brazil has a program it's kind of a program to allow to enable people who live in these kind of communities to be able to go to college. But of course, they need to be able to pass the test and satisfy these conditions in order to be able to do that. And so Albert Koh's team really helped them to really be able to do that. And a couple of them actually went to medical school. And so that's how we were able to win the trust of the community and to be able to work here for many, many years. And so, so you see the whole team here that's been working there for many, many years. And then just quickly, rheumatic heart disease. This is what I wanted to show you about in terms of I guess that reflects the title of this presentation. So rheumatic heart disease is a disease that actually gets started with just a very simple sore throat. It's a disease that if you hear a heart murmur in someone like my father's generation, that's probably due to rheumatic heart disease. It's hardly seen anymore in this country, but this is something that is highly prevalent in these slum communities all over the world. So it starts with just a very simple sore throat caused by group A streptococcus. And it's a very simple treatment. You just need to give antibiotics, very cheap antibiotics like amoxicillin. But frequently, even those cheap antibiotics are not available in these communities. So after many repeated episodes of infection, if they're not treated with antibiotic, the organism induces a type of autoimmune response that leads to collateral damage to the heart valves. And these heart valves ultimately end up getting replaced with artificial valves. And Brazil spends more than $50 million a year replacing these valves in these people. And there's a changing epidemiology of this disease that's being observed. So WHO, the prevalence that WHO estimated in the past, the peak occurs around a young adult age, 24 to 35 years of age. But two studies by one of our collaborators, the cardiologist, Dr. Kamara, found that the mean age in one study was 12 years, and in another later study, it was 9 years. So these are little kids who are developing congestive heart failure and mitral valve regurgitation. And I've never seen congestive heart failure occurring in these young kids in the US ever. So this is a pretty bad disease. And so we did a what's called a molecular epidemiology study of group-based strep. So one of the hypotheses is that these kids are getting repeatedly infected with different strains of the group-based strep. And when you get infected with multiple different strains, that may induce some sort of immune response that may actually be damaging to the heart valves. And so this genotyping of group-based strep is based on what's called a EMM typing, or it's an EMM gene that encodes a type of a membrane protein called the M protein. So there are many variants of this gene, and you can sequence them and then genotype the organism. So the most commonly reported EMM types around the world, or at least in the literature, are EMM 1 and 12. But there was a study that came out of Australia back in 2009 that showed that there was a higher diversity of EMM types observed among these group-based strep in the isolates from Africa and Pacific region countries compared to high-income countries. And this is what they found. So if you look here, EMM1 and EMM are the most common ones seen in high-income countries. And the bars shown in red are those that are included in this experimental vaccine that was developed against group-based strep, and greens are those that are not included in the vaccine preparation. Now, if you go to the African countries, yes, EMM12 is here, but it's at much lower frequency compared to the high-income country, as you can see. And then EMM1 is even lower. And if you go to the Pacific region countries, yes, EMM1 is here, way down here, but there's no EMM12 seen in Pacific region countries. So if this vaccine were to be given to Pacific region countries, it's going to have no impact. So we did the same thing here in Salvador. So we took, we studied kids who live right next to these clinics. So San Marcos and Quinto Central are two clinics that serve predominantly the favela kids. And George Valente is a private clinic that serves these high-income neighborhood community kids, privately insured families. And so when we look at the what's called the diversity, Simpson's diversity index, so higher the index, the higher the diversity of the strains. So in George Valente, the private clinic was 0.92, in Quinto Central is 0.97, and ESM it was a 0.96. And if you compare to the report that I just mentioned, the high-income countries, the diversity index was 92.1, identical to what we saw in George Valente. And if you look at the African and Pacific region countries, they were more closely related to what we found in these favela kids. So same city, but the strains that we found in the favela kids were those similar to those found in African and Pacific region countries. And the strains from the high-income neighborhood kids were actually closer to those found in Western European and North American countries. And why is that? And so, this was just totally surprising to us. And so, and then if you make the same sort of graphs that I just showed you with our data, so if you look at the George Valente, yes, 12 and 1 were the most common ones, right? Just like we saw in high-income countries. But if you look at the Emergency San Marcos, 12 and 1, they were there, but at much lower frequency. In Quinto Central, it's even lower. So if this experimental vaccine were to be given to these kids in the same city of Salvador, it would have far less efficacy in kids who live in the slums. So this is what I mean by the vicious cycle, the title. So you have the socioeconomic and environmental factors that do the crowding, lack of access to healthcare, poor sanitation. So here you see the disparity at the social level. But these factors contribute to the biological factors that we just identified. And so You have increased transmission of group-based strep because of crowding, and greater frequency of horizontal gene transfer. So when you have mixture of these different strains of group-based strep, streptococcal organisms are notorious for exchanging their genetic material. So if you have them close together, then exchange your genetic material. So of course, you're going to have higher diversity of the strains. So you have here disparity at the cellular level. So there are two types of disparity. One, this is social disparity, but there's also biological disparity at the bacterial cellular level, which is something that people don't often talk about. And that's just as important as social disparity. Because if we knew this, then the so-called experimental vaccine that was developed would have included these genotypes found in the favelas. We just completely missed that. And this creates a vicious cycle. So this biological disparity will then in turn further exacerbate the social disparity. And then the exacerbation of social disparity, again, in turn will further exacerbate the biological disparity. And this keeps going. And this is exactly what happens and ultimately leads to rheumatic heart disease. And so now closer to home, this is with the disparity that we've seen with the human papillomavirus infection among African-American women in the southeast region of the US versus white women who live in the same region of the US. So if you look at mild cervical dysplasia occurring in African-American women, they found these HPV types, 33, 35, 58, and 68. If you look at the white women with the same type of cervical lesion, the type of HPV types, genotypes, were different. And in fact, 16 and 18 are the ones that are most frequently said to be most frequently associated with cervical cancer. And these are the ones that are included in the HPV vaccine. These types that they found in African-American were not included in the early HPV vaccines. And if you look at the more advanced disease, again, we don't see 16 and 18, but the white women in the region do carry a 16 and 18. And so the early vaccine, the bivalent and quadrivalent vaccine did not include 16 and 18. And then in 2014, Merck came out with a Gardasil 9, which includes 9 of these genotypes, or the HPV types. And here they do include the ones that were found in African-American women living in the southeast region of the US. And so these women who received the early forms of the vaccine, they're going to go on to develop cervical cancer. And when they develop cancer, cervical cancer, 10, 15, 20 years from now, people are going to say, oh, this is because of racism and injustice and social disparity. And that's absolutely true. But that's not enough to just say that. That the reason they're going to develop the cervical cancer is because they didn't get the right type of vaccine. Now, of course, Merck did not intentionally exclude these genotypes. They just didn't know. They just didn't do the homework that needed to be done. And that's really unfortunate, because that not even thinking about that to do this kind of homework is what leads to the social disparity in the end, and biological disparity. So that's sort of the lesson from what we learned in Brazil, that it also applies to what happens in this country as well. So maybe I can stop here for a second and just open up for discussion. Then I can just kind of end it.
Yeah, Lee, thank you very much for an eye-opening presentation. I want to ask what you think should be done because of this situation. Certainly, the drug companies need to be sampling what kind of pathogens there are in these other populations. But besides that, are there policy measures, or are there other kinds of things that could improve this situation?
So, we're just a bunch of infectious disease researchers, and we don't really quite know how to sort of translate our scientific findings into real policy. But in Brazil, over the years we've been doing this, we discovered that Brazil is actually very receptive to some of the research findings that we made. For instance, when we did our first study and published our first study on leptospirosis, we thought that, we'll get kicked out of Brazil, but no, they actually invited us to set up a similar surveillance systems in other cities in Brazil on leptospirosis. It was a very important study in that we found major risk factors for the infection, and over the years, I think that this team has been working there. They've developed educational materials and pamphlets and had these the annual health fairs and really educated the public. And it's a disease that's easily preventable. All they need to do is just close off these flood-prone areas of their neighborhood, and put in piped water and have people avoid wading in these flooded areas. And over the years, and again, because of Dr. Mittermeier, who was also closely connected to the municipal government, he was able to persuade the city to make some infrastructure changes in these communities. And so over the years, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the number of people who were dying from this disease. And so, it's not something that we did ourselves, but it's something that community organization itself did in working movement to make these infrastructure changes. So a lot of these things, are easily controlled by just tried and true public health measures. And so a lot of it, all these kind of interventions that can be made are really out of our hands. But we do provide, I guess, the data that's useful for them, and that seems to have worked in some situations. Now, in other places, where we've done this, people were not that receptive, and so things have not worked out the way we want.
Yeah. So Lee, maybe you can stop sharing your slides, and
Sure.
we'll get to gallery view of everybody.
Right.
Because I do want to open the floor to questions. One reason I want to ask about the greater diversity is that because these new variants are appearing faster in those kinds of conditions, because in that sense, the whole sense of trying to outrun the evolution of a disease is a big challenge that people are worried about with COVID.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So really looking at these populations would be critical to make sure that you can go as fast as the disease is, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, in these communities, many of them don't end up getting treated with antibiotics, right? And so, they're getting repeatedly infected. And that's what triggers this type of consequence of rheumatic heart disease. In these privately insured clinics, they can easily get the antibiotics, so the organisms are immediately eliminated, and they're not transmitted from one person to another when they go back to their households or communities. And so, I think that's what's going on. And I think that applies to COVID virus as well, right? That if people are not vaccinated, then there's more opportunity for transmission and more opportunities for these mutants to be established. And so, what we described with the simple, disease, group-based strep sore throat, really applies to these major pandemic-prone viruses like the SARS-CoV-2 as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's open the floor. Who has, anyone have a question or a comment?
I have a question.
Dhruv, I think I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Riley, it was a very nice presentation which you gave. My question is somewhere around the medicine which we are reading as of now. What I believe is that the medicine books as we read today, the sample size for them is Caucasian population, the white population, to look into it. Moving forward, what are your thoughts on the fact that I think we should have a more inclusive sample size for our symptoms and for our things, so that a lot of times this happens that obviously that like tuberculosis in USA or tuberculosis in in a European country shows different signs and symptoms from diseases in India or in any tropical country. What are your thoughts about it, and how can we reconcile this if it's possible? How is it?
No, I think having a forum like this, I think opens up these types of ideas, and I think we should take advantage of what we learn to really globalize the technology that we have to be able to do these sort of things. What we did in Salvador is not a highly technical type of work. We just needed to be able to genotype them, and that can be done in most places these days. And the same thing. So India, we had the Delta variant appear. But if the technology, India has the technology to be able to sequence the viruses, but if it could have been done sooner, maybe we could have blunted the uncontrolled surge of this variant. But you can say that, but look what happened in the U.S. We have this best technology in the world, and then we still managed to screw it all up. And so, unfortunately, just because you have the technology doesn't mean that we can actually do these things. There has to be a political will, and that's, I think, the bottom line. So that's why this leptospirosis work really worked in Salvador, because there was a political will in the city to do something about this. And so there's something that I'm learning as well, that just because we have the science and knowledge and facts, they don't often translate into real benefit. This COVID pandemic really unmasked this whole issue, right?
Yeah, it was a disaster waiting to happen. It happened.
Thank you. Other kinds of questions or comments from the floor? What are the kind of hot, pardon me for saying it this way, hot diseases that you will be looking at from now? What is next on your agenda?
Well, we are looking at COVID in Rio, but we also, in my lab here, and as well as in Brazil and India, and Kavita can tell you, Kavita is going to be working on the interaction of non-communicable chronic diseases with infectious disease. And this is something that's emerging in many developing countries. As countries get wealthier, these non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases like diabetes and COPD are really increasing. They're just exploding in these countries. In Brazil, diabetes, TB in diabetics have exploded, just really exploded compared to just TB in people without this chronic condition. And so that's true in India as well. So Kavita is actually looking at the urinary tract infection, which is the most common infectious disease of women. But many of these infections are highly drug resistant, very difficult to treat, and it's becoming more difficult to treat among women who have diabetes. And India has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. So that's something that I think we want to look at in many other parts of the world, the interaction of non-communicable diseases with multi-drug resistant bacterial infections, common infections like urinary tract infection and bloodstream infections. We're doing that in
Paulo,
Bangladesh as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Paulo, I see your hand.
Oh, thank you. Well, great talk, Lee. I'm pleased to see someone from a very nice group doing research on these things about here. Well, I live in a poor town. I mean, we have only about 30% of the Recife's population with proper sewage treatment.
Mm-hmm.
All the rest is really bad. And well, these diseases are quite familiar to me. And here is worse, a little bit worse, matters related to chikungunya, dengue, and Zika.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the mosquitoes are everywhere. In my house, I live in the 10th floor, so the mosquitoes gonna come up, but
Sure.
I just live by the river,
Mhm.
and it's in the lower floors. They have to have screens to protect.
Mhm. Sure.
So it's not very nice, and we run the risk of getting diseases
Sure.
of this nature.
Right. Right.
But I found it very interesting that the different types of strains of the virus from different subpopulations.
Mhm.
And I was so amazed about the sample bias for developing a vaccine. It's amazing that huge companies, they didn't do the proper job to
Right.
before developing. Richard is a professor in data mining, as I am, and the first thing is to do business understanding before developing the project. So I was quite
Exactly.
surprised by that.
Yeah.
So I'll comment on what you just said, Paolo, because I can imagine that it costs more money the more different strains of a virus you're trying to include in the vaccine development. And you do it quickly first to get something out there as quickly as possible. But you're right, people should have done much more careful sampling from the population. And that's kind of one of the outstanding things about your work, Lee, is that this really should change the way the pharmaceutical companies approach the problems.
But even, if they try to get these samples from Brazil, for the group A strep study, I think they're going to end up getting these strains from these kids who live in these rich communities, right? Because it's easier to get them. And these kids who live in these are totally they're invisible even to these people who do the drug trials, even within Brazil. And so, yes, they may have made an attempt to contact the researchers in Brazil to get the isolates, but the isolates they would have gotten would have been more likely to be from these kids who are, in these rich neighborhoods. And so they still would have not have come up with the right type of set or right sets of strains. Yeah.
Wow. So Martin, before you ask your question, there's a question in chat from Smarita. Smarita, I think, is in Kolkata, right? Where, she's seeing a noticeable increase in diseases in the community during the last 2 years. Is there anything she needs to know? TB on the belly button, herpes on the ears, and so forth.
I'm not exactly sure what she's asking.
That she's living in a part of India where she
Uh-huh.
is working with underserved communities.
Okay.
And I think she's seeing an increase in
Oh.
diseases. Is there anything that she needs to know? This is the age-old problem. How can you change the community and, of course, keep yourself safe, right?
Right. Well, so that would depend on what type of infectious agents that are circulating in those communities you work in, what kind of diseases that you're seeing. So I think, again, doing some preliminary type of research or investigation is very important to really understand the biology of what's going on. So again, it's not enough to just, look at social and economic determinants of these disease outcomes, but really doing the biology. So,
Yeah, and Smarita followed up her original question by saying, is there any connection to COVID? Is COVID acting as some sort of a catalyst in the community that would increase other diseases?
Sure. So we're actually in India, they're seeing these very unusual fungal diseases that appear to be connected to the COVID infection. There's called mucormycosis. And India has seen more cases of mucormycosis in the last year during the pandemic than the entire, pre-pandemic period. And so we don't know what the mechanism of that is, but that is something that's being seen in India.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, you asked what's happening with the homeless population in the US.
Yeah, it's getting worse. Yeah, every time in fact, there's a small encampment that's being created right next to our new School of Public Health building on campus. And so, yeah, I think we're going to continue to, as long as we see this huge disparity in income, right? The Silicon Valley types, the gentrification that we're seeing in places like Oakland and people getting displaced. So we're just seeing more and more. And then, of course, the pandemic didn't help. And we're going to see the kind of diseases that, I've been describing in these communities. There was a big outbreak of hepatitis A in these communities in San Diego and Santa Cruz. So yeah, we're going to continue to see evolution of these diseases that, we thought we were able to control.
So it's really good that you're doing the study of how scientifically these the bad social conditions lead to the disease. I mean, it's amazing to me that that wasn't looked at before. But in some ways, I guess new technology, like being able to
we're able to do those things. Yeah,
identify the different strains is a big help.
Yeah. So if I could just
other questions.
Go
ahead.
No, I was going to say
do.
I have just a video that I want to show just to end this, if I may. If there are no other questions, is that okay?
I think that would be great.
So let me just show. Okay. Let me just show this. If it works, let's see. So one thing, Paulo mentioned the Zika situation in Recife. So we're saying the same thing in Rio, and I just want to quickly show you this. And so this is led former director of CDC to say, never before in history has there been a situation where a bite from a mosquito could result in devastating malformation, and that's the congenital Zika syndrome. So these are pictures were taken by my collaborator, Dr. Claudette Cardoso, who's a pediatric infectious disease expert. And so, in February 2016, the World Health Organization declared this disease a public health emergency of international concern. And then a few months later, WHO declared the end of the emergency. And then Brazil itself declared end of the emergency in May of 2017. But the problem is, once these kids are born, it's just the beginning. And so now it's almost 6 years after this happened, and most of these kids are still alive. And so Dr. Cardoso created a clinic just to follow these families with these babies, and they are growing. And one of the bright aspects of this devastating condition is that this virus can't take smiles away from these kids. So they have all kinds of cognitive developmental deficits and physical deficits, but there's some hope that with care and a lot of physical and emotional and cognitive support, they can live some semblance of normal life. So it just makes, and I don't know if you knew about this, that in 2016 Olympics in Rio, just a couple months before the Olympics started, there was a game. It's called the Street Child Games. Did you know about this? And this was not published at all. This happened in Rio, and so I want to show you the video of this, and then we'll finish. So let's see if it works. Maybe it won't work. Oh, there.
Is it embedded in your PowerPoint?
Can you see it or? You see
Or
it?
did you click on a link? If you clicked on the link and it went to a different site, then you're
Oh.
not sharing that site.
Oh.
You would stop this share and start the other share.
Okay, okay, I see.
That might work.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. There we go.
There we go.
Now you guys see it.
Mhm.
Lee, thank you for that upbeat way to
So it's just, I think, one more
bring
minute.
this in. Okay, I see.
So that was, yeah, these, kids, they had their time and in this event, and now they're back in the streets in the countries that they came from. So we can't forget them.
Absolutely right. And when we talk about the importance of environmental sustainability, social sustainability is also really important. That's a really good video. It's very, thank you. And Lee, thank you so much for a great presentation today.
Thank
This
you.
has
It
been
was a real pleasure.
eye-opening.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Mhm.
You're very welcome. So Martine, let me ask you if you'd say a few words and close.
Absolutely, yes. And I apologize for missing a few minutes. All of a sudden, our internet was down. Nothing was working anymore. So I think I'd like to stop or end with a question that I wanted to ask Dr. Riley, but we'll keep it as a start for a new conversation maybe. And I was thinking about, is or can telemedicine be some kind of an equalizer now that we have the ability to reach the hard-to-reach communities and make sure that they are included in the research programs that we now have available. So we have Dhruv Kakkar here from Rugia working with the last mile population. We have Smrita Singh Gupta in Calcutta, very interested in setting up some kind of a telehealth clinic for the women and the children in the red light area. We have Shiri Duville here, who wrote a bestseller. One of her interest areas is telehealth. So maybe that's a good start for a new discussion on telemedicine and what we can do from there. So thank you all for coming and joining us today with Silicon Valley Global Health. We aim to initiate conversations just like the one we had today, focused on the challenges around healthcare and public health on a public scale, so that we may learn from each other and how we may see that it all relates to our own backyard. So what are the lessons that we can learn and apply right here today? We know there is no one answer, that there is no such thing as one size fits all. And so that's why these conversations are so important to learn and to understand. So we invite you to join us for next time. If you would like to review the session of today, it will be available in a few days on our website, and we'll make sure you get the link. Last month, we had Dr. Lebeau talking about the link between public health and plastic pollution. Next month, October, we'll have Ambassador Sluwagen. He's the Consul General of Belgium in Los Angeles, who's going to share some European perspectives on how to curb a pandemic. Again, it's all about what can we learn from each other, and once we know better, let's do better. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Dr. Riley. And
Thank you
thanks to
again.
everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
I'll turn off the recording now and
Mhm.
yeah,
Okay, good night.
thanks.
Good night.